Hi, David.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Well, I'm a little nervous to be sitting in Mickey Kouse's chair, figuratively speaking. I don't feel adequate to the occasion. I don't have any props. I don't have any sex scandals.
Who among us is adequate for that task, David?
But I spent a lot of time looking for a sex scandal to bring you, because I know how much you enjoy those, but I couldn't come up with any.
Well, there's one, I think, going on even as we speak, but I'm sure Mickey's got that covered, so we can leave that aside.
Yeah, he's like that guy we have here in Washington, Massachusetts Avenue, who would stand in front of the papal embassy with a big sign saying that there was the priests molest boys, and we all drove past him thinking he was a total nut, and what do you know, the priests were molesting the boys. He was right.
Now, Mickey actually stands on street corners with a sign that says John Edwards has a love child.
Well, truth is the best defense. What can I say?
No, he does. He really does. I mean, if it weren't for his blog, he'd do that 24/7, but he only does it a few days a week. So yeah, you're as regular viewers know, Mickey Kouse, my usual counterpart, is taking summer vacation until the conventions, and as you said, it's hard to find somebody who can fill his shoes, but I was looking for somebody who had two qualifications. One is it had to be a brilliant and original thinker and a leading public intellectual, and I'm sure you'd agree that you fit that bill, right, David?
I'm prepared to accept it for the sake of argument.
Oh, okay. We've got that on tape. And the other thing is, I wanted it to be somebody who, like Mickey, raises the blood pressure of our liberal viewers. And I figured, who better than the guy who wrote The Axis of Evil speech?
All right, well, that's how we know we're alive, if our blood pressure goes up.
Yes,
so
we do. And when there's evil in the world, David, that's the other thing that keeps us vibrant.
Well, I brought something that may raise blood pressure. Maybe this is something to start with. Yesterday, the Department of Housing and Urban Development released a big new study of homelessness in the United States that I think confirms that under the very different policies of the Bush administration institute, there has been a dramatic decline in homelessness, and especially chronic homelessness, the hardest cases, about 30% probably over the past couple of years. And I commend to viewers an article in the Atlantic Monthly, which is a profile of the individual, Philip Magano, who was the leading advocate of this new approach, and he looks like he has been vindicated, and we've made more. It's like
what can you tell us what the new approach is in a nutshell? And this is, I mean, I gather there's some of it that can be implemented at the federal level, but to some extent, this is a question of cities copying the model on their own or not.
It's a question of cities complying with new kinds of federal regulations.
Okay.
The big question about the homeless has always been, is this a problem of housing policy, or is this really a mental health problem? And many of the advocates wanted to merge the problem of the homeless population with the low-income population generally, and to say that their proper response is to fund the building of a lot of low-income housing using federal dollars. The new departure in the Bush years was to say, as a lot of conservatives have argued, that this population is very different from the low-income population. They do have chronic mental health problems, drug problems, and the answer is not to build just more low-income housing generally, but to put this particular population into supported living arrangements where there's drug treatment, where there's various kinds of mental health options available to them. And if you focus just on that and on the hardest core population, and basically give them some kind of supervision and assistance, not just an apartment, that you can make a big difference with relatively modest cost, and that now seems to have been borne out.
Okay, now the kind of distant backdrop for this problem, as some of our viewers may be too young to remember, is, in I guess like the 60s, you didn't see a whole lot of homeless people in cities, and one thing that led to the problem was the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill, right?
Which two things. The deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill, which was a 1970s policy, which happened to coincide with the revival, or the beginnings of a revival of a lot of central city neighborhoods. So it used to happen that the mentally ill would come out of these institutions, or people with substance abuse problems, and they would then go to a flop house on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and get a room for $10 a night.
And nobody cared.
Well, at exactly the moment when we began these massive deinstitutionalizations, we also began converting those flop houses, or knocking them down, and building condos in their stead. So there was a rising market in the central city areas that had been the old Skid Rows, at the same time as you have the arrival of hundreds of thousands of deinstitutionalized people.
Okay, so and one reason for the deinstitutionalization, I gather, was that there was some concern about abuses. In other words, of people too casually being committed involuntarily to institutions, and also to kind of leaving the people in these institutions with, people who, some of whom might have eventually recovered, but who were kind of left there because out of sight, out of mind, right? And
well, I in one of my previous lives, I wrote a big history of the 1970s, and I was very interested in this topic. And it's one of these things, like a lot of public policy, that there are a lot of, we look back at a lot of public policy things that don't work the way we that we would wish them to do, and we say, the people involved must have been crazy or deluded or stupid, and you then bump up against the fact that public policy is hard, there are unintended consequences, and a lot of things that are not crazy ideas to begin with don't work out so well. So it was not a crazy idea to say that maintaining these vast mental health hospitals and warehousing hundreds of thousands of people, often involuntarily, there's a famous experiment that was done where a psychologist sent students, grad students in psychology, to see if they could talk their way into being diagnosed as insane, and they were not to give any false answers, they were not to lie or tell stories, they were just to report some very vague symptoms and otherwise be themselves. And it turned out that your chance of being it was completely random, arbitrary. So letting people out of these institutions, the promise was there would then be some kind of community care. That never materialized, and that was the origin of this problem. And then in the 80s, the Reagan years, it became used as a bludgeon against the policies of the Reagan administration, all of them, because of the homeless were the most visible signs of what was supposedly wrong with this new heartless America. And it became then an ideological stalking horse. And I'm going to make the ideological point by saying, inconveniently, it turns out that the conservative ideas about how to deal with this have been proven not 100% right, because that never happens, but more right than the things we were doing before 2001.
Although it doesn't sound to me, on the face of it, as if this policy would antagonize, in and of itself, would antagonize a lot of liberals. In other words, a lot of them might agree better than doing nothing. It may also be true that some of them would rather have subsidized low-income housing or something, but it's not a policy that, am I missing something? What is it that liberals would complain about the policy itself? One reason I brought up the deinstitutionalization issue is because I can imagine the allegation that this is going to replicate some of those problems. In other words, we're going to stick these people in these places where actually not much gets done from them and nobody pays any attention. But you tell me, what is the liberal objection to this? If I had done my homework, what would I be saying right now?
I don't actually think your kind of liberal would find a lot to object to here, but the homeless advocates, and probably people who are somewhat to your left, would find something to object to, which is this is not a broad-based attack on the problems of everything. That homelessness was one of those issues, like crime, and dare I say it, like terrorism, where we're often told you're not allowed to solve this problem unless you solve a whole galaxy of problems that are associated with this problem. You can't just deal with the I forget what the slogan is, but you have to deal with the root causes. You can't just put criminals in jail and think that will make things better. You have to eradicate poverty and discrimination. You can't just put the most disturb people on the streets into some kind of assisted living situation. You have to deal with the inadequacy of the housing available to poor Americans generally, and you can draw your own analogy with terrorism. I think that is where people...
Well, actually, if you want to bring... I mean, not to get sidetracked, but it does seem to me that your side...
I was segueing, actually. I was giving you an opening.
Well, I would say your side's prescription for dealing with terrorism actually does, in the case of invading Iraq, that was an attempt to address some grassroots, what you thought were grassroots, in an extremely ambitious way that involved remaking an entire country. So, I'm not sure I'd be deploying the analogy the way.
No, I think it's actually it's useful. And let me recommend. Since I'm doing things to raise people's blood pressure, since that's my job, let me recommend to people a book that I've just finished that I think is really interesting and that has gotten not enough attention because it doesn't contain a lot of sensational revelations. It just contains a narrative, and that's Doug Feith's book about the Iraq War. And one of the points that there's a point that Doug Feith makes and then one that he doesn't make that I think are relevant here. The point that he makes was that the reason the administration went to war in Iraq was they perceived a genuine danger that this is the place where the next attack is most likely to come from. A lot of people believed that, and so they went into Iraq for very traditional national security reasons intensified by the emotions of 9/11. The point that he doesn't make is that the administration, that a lot of the vaulting rhetoric about democracy came from two sources. One was the embarrassment at not finding the stocks of weapons of mass destruction. And so the administration then, after the fact, talked much more about this than it had intended before the fact. And then second, I think some of the internal politics of the administration, where I say this as a speechwriter myself, where it sometimes did seem the speechwriters were running the asylum. And a lot of things were said and done for rhetorical reasons that were not actually always the best guides to what was going on inside the thinking of the administration.
Well, I mean, it's certainly true that there was no shortage of motivations cited by the advocates of the war itself. And in retrospect, this gives them the opportunity to do what you're doing, which is going back and dismissing the multiplicity of motivations which now seem ridiculous and saying, no, the core motivations were the ones that seem less ridiculous, but it doesn't seem to me that's playing fair. I mean, they said we're doing it for all these reasons, and if most of them now look stupid, it seems to me the policy just looks misguided. But anyway, that's ancient history.
Well,
I mean, and anyway, to the point of root causes, did you not? Were you not among those who said, yeah, it would be nice to implant a democracy in the heart of the Middle East?
Sure. Let me put it this way. I think, and I actually wrote about this in the book I co-wrote with Richard Pearl.
He's in the news lately, by the way, but I digress.
He is in the news. He's always in the news. That's Richard. He's the news follows him. For sure, I think one of the things that a lot of people who were in favor of the war shared was the diagnosis that the lack of democracy was a very important cause of terrorism. And I think that judgment stands the test of time. The question, and sometimes this was put too strongly, the question was, well, does that mean that instituting democracy is going to be the answer? There are a lot of situations where the fact that you've identified the cause doesn't mean that eliminating that cause is going to be the solution for ongoing problems. I think that part of the story doesn't look so good. That there was any hope of making a swift transition to democracy in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, or even Pakistan, for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, the part I'd agree with is countries are probably less likely to produce terrorists if both the political and the economic system provides an outlet for the energies of young men, other than, doing illicit things, and other than becoming part of radical political movements. I would personally stress the economic side at least as much as the political side. Thereafter, I think the disagreement sets in. I mean, and it has partly to do with the relationship between the economic and the political. I mean, I think you're much better off trying to engage nations economically, and I think that tends to have a politically liberalizing effect, and it takes a very long time, but I just think it's overly ambitious to think you can invade the countries and implant the things. But, I imagine you're feeling a little more upbeat about the war than the last time we talked, and even last time we talked, you were contending that history might yet judge the war a success. So I'm thinking, things have looked better in the intervening 6 months or whatever, or however long it's been. So I guess you're probably framing things in a fairly positive way these days on the war.
Fairly positive. I wouldn't want to get the analogy that I think springs to mind on the war is that it's often compared to by critics to Vietnam. I think the judgment of history will be that it will look a lot more like the Philippine insurrection at the beginning of the 20th century, which is, to the extent that people remember the Philippines, I think a lot of people still wonder whether it was a good idea or not. But the United States did restore order, did at a significant cost. I think I don't remember the exact number of casualties, but they were measured in the thousands, not the hundreds. And of course, the consequences of the Philippines were pretty tough as well. And there remain, to those interested, intense arguments about both the practicality and the morality of that conflict. But it did come to an end on terms that were reasonably satisfactory to the United States. And I think Iraq is going to look a lot more like that than like the acknowledged debacle of Vietnam.
But of course, the Philippines was in real terms much more remote, in a certain sense, from
Well, everything
our
was
interest
wiped
in
out.
those days. In other words, it didn't matter if you antagonized a whole bunch of people in the course of doing whatever you did, because it's not like they were going to be the next day trying to mount a terrorist assault on America or American interests all over the world, whereas I think this is a little different in that regard. Right? I mean, the blowback, the collateral damage, you might say, matters a lot more these days in the Middle East than it did in the Philippines then.
The collateral damage remains awfully hypothetical. I just think if you count, I mean, people always say this, but is it? Can you measure it? I mean, that when you look at the frequency and tempo of terrorist attempts against the United States, there look to be a lot more of them. There have been a lot more of them in the 1990s than there have been in the period since 9/11. Now, you can't do a pure experiment. The security's better now than it was before 9/11, and the cooperation with other countries is better. There are all kinds of other things going on. But one of the things that I follow is when you look at the tempo of attempts from 1990 to 2001, you see a rising cycle. You see a rising level of sophistication, with the attempts getting more dangerous, more sophisticated, more global, involving more people. And then since 9/11, a declining level of sophistication. And
you mean in America or around the world?
Well, in the Western world. I mean, 9/11 is a much more sophisticated attack than the attack on the Madrid train station.
Well, yeah, that's a completely unique data point. I mean, I wouldn't
Madrid
say
more sophisticated than
that's
London.
enough to plot a trend relative to. But anyway,
I'm not suggesting. As I say, these are human events. They're very difficult to compare in anything that's remotely scientific. But I don't see a lot of evidence for the proposition that there has been this dangerous blowback and may materialize.
Well, but you see, it's characteristic of blowback that it's extremely hard to discern for a long time and maybe forever. I mean, who would have thought in 1953, when we supported a coup in Iran, if I've got the year right, that in the late 1970s that would come back to haunt us, which I think it did. But, and who would have thought that in the late 1970s, when we supported the anti-Soviet forces in Afghanistan, that would create a kind of cauldron that would create the bin Ladens of the world and would come back to haunt us? And who would have thought that the Persian Gulf War, would leave these because it left American troops there, bin Laden would come back and see them and get all upset or whatever happened. I mean, in some of these cases, I think you'd probably acknowledge that, yes, there were nasty side effects, and I think you have to acknowledge they were very long-term. They stayed below the surface a very long time. And in any event, it's just, in a kind of obvious way, characteristic of the kind of blowback we're talking about, which is a bunch of individuals getting upset and going off and plotting, and not leaving a paper trail necessarily about what upset them. It's characteristic of that kind of blowback that, A, it's not going to surface immediately, and B, when it does, its roots are not always going to be easy to trace, right?
Okay. Much truth in what you say, and there are always unintended consequences to any action, and you want to be careful about pressing this line, because otherwise you end up like Pat Buchanan saying we shouldn't have fought the Germans because the Soviets ended up in East Germany, and that nothing ends exactly the way you would like it, and that doesn't mean that the best choice is always inaction. But I want to make a point about the first example you cited, Iran. We have to be careful. A lot of what is cited as blowback turns out to look more like special pleading. I mean, from what I have read about the coup against Mossadegh, and I agree with you, it looks, in retrospect, like a real mistake. In that category of Cold War interventions that, where you solved a tiny little problem at the expense of buying yourself a lot of grief. The classic example of this is the coup against Allende, which, where in order to solve an extremely remote possibility of a communist coup in Chile, the United States got it, which I don't think it had the level of guilt in Chile that's often ascribed to it, but still, the American fingerprints were left on one of the worst attacks on democracy in Latin America, and this terrible regime was installed, unbelievably bloody, much bloodier than they needed to be even by their own lights, and we've all borne the disgrace of that for a third of a century and probably for a lot longer. That said, it's worth remembering that the coup against Mossadegh had the support of important elements inside Iran, of which the most important were the Shiite clergy. They were against Mossadegh and they were in favor of the coup. So it rubs a little against the grain when you now hear the spokesman of that clerical regime, people who are the servitors of the Khomeiniites and the people who are on the anti-Mossadegh side, citing the overthrow of Mossadegh as one of the great atrocities against Iranian independence. This is a case where you wonder, are these blowback claims always on the level, or are they sometimes are they sometimes manifestations of a symptom we see in the Middle East, where whatever happens, the United States is guilty. If it intervenes, it's guilty of intervention. If it doesn't intervene, it's guilty of propping up dictatorships. And when everything you do is wrong, even if you do the exact opposite things, you have to wonder whether the stated grounds of complaint are really the actual grounds of complaint.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I'm not just talking about the historical grievance of the coup itself. I agree with you. Special pleading happens. People look for grievances to justify their power grabs and so on. On the other hand, when a grievance is handy and that's what they use to incite their followers, it becomes relevant that you are kind of the butt of the grievance, right? Because then their followers do get riled up against you. But the other thing I'd say is it's not just the coup itself. It's that this put us in this relationship to the Shah, who had this repressive police force, which did repress this very revolutionary movement, that created the ongoing, not inaccurate perception that the United States, from their point of view, was the enemy. So it was that whole aftermath of the coup as well. But my point is just these things are hard to I always find myself speaking as someone who stresses the way the kind of blowback that makes life easier on terrorist recruiters. I'm often in this position of finding it a little hard to really rigorously corroborate, my side of the argument. And I'm just making the case that to some extent that's an intrinsic problem with this side of the argument by virtue of the dynamics we're describing. But as far as unfortunate blowback or unfortunate consequences of the Iraq War, this is far from the only thing I'd cite. I would also say that, look, few things are scarier these days than nuclear weapons that A, might be deployed by a hostile nation state, although I don't think that's a huge threat, or B, might get in the hands of terrorists. And in that regard, I'm not all that sanguine about the possibility that Iran may have nukes, or the fact that Pakistan has them and is not looking any stabler these days than it used to be. And it seems to me on both of those fronts, those are arguably the highest magnitude problems in the Middle East from the point of view of long-term American interests. It seems to me on both of those fronts the war has hurt us, because it has put us, with respect to Iran, it's just limited the hand we can play against them, because they do have the capacity to wreak some unknown amount of havoc in Iraq. And in the case of Pakistan, the standard argument is, and I suppose there's at least some truth to it, that the diversion of resources from that whole area of operations, including Afghanistan, has put us in a worse position than we would be. Well, so I think that those may be two of the higher costs of the war.
I'm not sure that there is anything that we had any realistic chance to do against Iran that we are in a position that we can't do now.
What about bombing? I wouldn't be all that enthusiastic about that anyway, but you might be more than I am. I don't know, but certainly
no.
if the U.S. would be more likely to acquiesce in an Israeli bombing of Iran, if you think that's any kind of short-term solution, I think, if it were not the case, that Iran could, in the course of a few months, make things look much worse for us in Iraq and for Bush's legacy, should they have that provocation.
But I don't think that it was ever really in the cards that we were going to bomb Iran, and I've been writing this for 4 years, that it's just not very likely for all kinds of reasons. One is the hostage-taking reason, that they put these factories in places where if you're going to bomb them in a way where you're really sure they're bombed, you're going to kill a lot of people, and more than the United States is going to have appetite to do without an immediate provocation. Second, and maybe more fundamental, remember that the people who are most alarmed about the Iranian bomb also tend to have the most optimistic attitude about the attitudes of the Iranian population toward the United States. And so a lot of the debate over Iran is, okay, if you bomb, what you get is some delay in the Iranian nuclear program. What you forfeit is the possibility of a rapid return to a friendship with Iran after the collapse of the mullahocracy. And since the people who are like most pro-bombing are also the people who are most optimistic about the likelihood of those things happening, what that meant in the internal debates in the administration was that it wasn't going to happen, because the big prize was not a nuclear-free Iran. It was a Western-oriented Iran out from under the clerical regime.
Well, that seems to me like sound reasoning. I'm not sure whether you're endorsing it or just attributing it to the administration.
No, I think that's both. I think that is both an accurate account of what happened. I think the fear of casualties is also a big part of it, and I also think it happens to be right, that the consequences to future Iranian-American friendship from dropping bombs all over the territory of Iran are not going to be very positive, and that friendship is a really big prize, maybe the biggest prize there is in the Middle East.
Will that still be your view if they are one day away from actually having the bomb in 3 years or something?
Well, I tend to take the view that although when we talk about this, we talk about you have the bomb or you don't have the bomb, and it's kind of a binary situation. I think the more we learn about the spread of these weapons through what we used to call the third world, you realize it's a little bit more complicated than that. Like North Korea, in one sense, has the bomb. It has a bunch of nuclear material, and it was able to detonate it, but it was only able to produce a 1,000 kiloton, or what was it? I forget now the numbers, but it was a very small. It was a 1 kiloton explosion. That is 1/15 the size of the Hiroshima bomb, and about as much explosive power as is carried by a single American bomber, I think. So, how fearsome is North Korea today? How much war?
Actually, in the hands of a terrorist, I would not celebrate the development of the weapon you've just described. It depends on how you're going to use it.
I'm not celebrating. That is a worry.
I take your point. Sorry, go ahead.
But if you if you want to be really frightened about the trend of our world, is as we move away from a world in which it's the United States balanced by another superpower, and maybe that world will come again if the Chinese continue to develop. But you've got a lot of small actors out there for whom nuclear warfighting is actually a more realistic prospect than it ever was for the United States and the Soviet Union. And then the quality and accuracy
small nation states, or you mean sub-nation state actors?
You can imagine an Indo-Pac nuclear war. I sure can, unfortunately.
Almost through misunderstanding of the kind, we tried to prevent during the Cold War, but almost through, a kind of launch-on warning mishap.
Right. But poor command and control, use it or lose it, all kinds of things. So to go back to Iran, I mean, they may have the material. They may have some ability to build some kind of warhead. It may not be a very good warhead. Do they have the ability to put it on a missile? Do they have the ability to fire the missile? I'm sure you saw that exercise that Tony Cordesman did, where he imagined a future Israeli-Iranian nuclear war. And contrary to what, I forget now which blowhard cleric it was who said that all it needs is one bomb and Israel's abolished and Islam would survive, that his projection was, with any kind of realistic projection forward of what they're likely to have in the next decade or two, that the war ends with terrible casualties in Israel, maybe as much as a 20th of the population would die, but the complete extinction of Iran as a functioning society.
I would think, yeah. Well, what do you, enough about the Iraq War and its possible implications in the geopolitical sphere. What about in the political sphere? Are you thinking that the generally kind of seemingly stabilizing drift of things, notwithstanding some kind of horrific suicide bombings earlier this week, that helps McCain?
I'd like to believe that. Boy, do I wish that were true. But it seems, I just feel like the Republican Party is like an employee that's on the verge of being fired, and it almost doesn't matter what you do.
I hope so, but
it doesn't. Had a year and a half ago, had you said to the central brain of the Republican Party, here's what Iraq is going to look like in the summer of 2008, Republicans said, well, gee, I mean, half our problem is solved. And yet, even though there's a lot of poll data that shows that the public now thinks the war is going better than it did 18 months ago, they still regard the decision to go in as a tremendous mistake. And anyway, when you ask them what are you voting on the basis of, they're not thinking about that so much. They are concerned about domestic economic issues where the news, it's not yet bad, but it's so terribly ominous The unemployment numbers are okay. We haven't had a big downturn in national income. The economic growth remains above zero. I love this expression, flat is the new up. But people are frightened, and they look at the turmoil in the mortgage market. They feel the squeeze on their household income from fuel prices and food prices and tuition if they have kids in school, in college. And it's very hard to know how an incumbent party comes from behind on that, unless it can count on the challengers to make some horrible mistake. And the one thing I think you have to say about Barack Obama is avoiding horrible mistakes is something that through a lifetime he's demonstrated some skill at.
Well, I wish I were as optimistic about Obama as your analysis.
That's not optimism.
Should be.
That's not optimism.
No, that's not. No, I said I was careful the way I said that. I didn't say as you are. I said as your analysis implies that I should be.
Okay, sorry, I didn't hear it.
I know you're not. I know that's not a cause for cheer, an Obama presidency for you. But I mean, first of all, I think the so-called Bradley effect. That is to say, people being reluctant to tell pollsters that they're not going to vote for a black man. Is possibly more pronounced than we realize because. Remember, the polls now are national polls, and the only thing we have any empirical experience with Obama is essentially Democratic electorates during the primaries. Even there you saw some hints of a Bradley effect. And by the way, an analysis I'd like to see...
How big was the Bradley effect for Bradley?
What's that?
How big was the Bradley effect for Bradley?
I don't know how big it was said to be. The other data point is Doug Wilder, but I don't know either of those cases. The analysis I'd like to see would be to look at Obama in different primary states, depending on whether independents were allowed to vote, and to see if you saw a bigger effect there. But certainly in New Hampshire, he tremendously underperformed relative to the polls, right? And there were independents voting, I think.
It's an open state, that's right.
Yeah, so that's the analysis I'd like to see. Maybe I'm too pessimistic, but I personally think that a 5-point cushion in the polls is nothing for him, A. B, I think the direction of the Iraq War, I don't think it's a dramatic boost for McCain for a couple of reasons. One is that to the extent that the surge seems to vindicate McCain, that also implies that things are going well enough in Iraq so that Obama's timetable for withdrawal seems less and less hasty, so it has that upside for him. And then the other thing is that if Afghanistan continues to head south, then the costs, according to the conventional wisdom about how we diverted resources from Afghanistan to fight Iraq, then the costs of the initial invasion seem greater. And I think both of those things tend to help Obama. So I do think the benefit that McCain gets from the seeming trend in Iraq now is limited. But I don't know. I guess I never. I mean, maybe this leads us to something I wanted to talk about anyway. I'm too cynical to discount the power of attacks on a person's patriotism, which I think is clearly a big part of McCain's strategy in a certain sense. For example, even things like, both McCain's and kind of the movements, right? I mean, as soon as the posters started coming out about Obama's address in the Tiergarten in Germany, the right-wing blogosphere started saying, I don't know what the critique was exactly. Does this remind you of Hitler talking to a bunch of Germans or something?
I think that was John. That was John Stewart who said that.
Yeah,
actually.
Well, and some of them just kind of,
I was one of the attackers. I wrote a column actually, but it was then put on a blog, so it counts as the blogosphere, saying that I thought the speech was very revealing of some of the things that are wrong with the way Obama sees the world, including his dislike of acknowledging the reality of conflict. When you look through that speech, what you see again and again and again is wherever he talks about conflict, it's always with inanimate objects. So he has this phrase where he says, I think I quoted it correctly, that materials from Pakistan and secrets from, I forget where, can detonate a bomb in Paris. Well, materials and secrets can't make bombs. You need an actual human bomb maker to put them together. And again, one of the conceits of his rhetoric through that speech is the refusal to acknowledge that there are hostile individual human beings in the world.
That acknowledgement would play both ways ideologically. I would say you not only have to have the person, you have to have the person who hates America to want to do it. What kinds of policies have made people hate America lately? I mean, that's a liberal. Yeah. That's a liberal line. So I don't see how bringing human beings into it necessarily would help your side.
But he doesn't do it. It tells you something about the way at least his tongue works. I don't know whether his mind works that way. And that is part of how he thinks. That said, I mean, he does have a 6-point lead in the polls, and he's had a lead almost consistently since securing the nomination. And I mean, the question that when I think about this is, do I think the economic news in November or September is going to be better than it is today? And I look at these stories. There was one of the FT last week about how the credit that defaults on these mortgages are beginning to show up at higher and higher income levels.
Tell me about it. But I don't want to get personal.
Well, I hope we don't have a revelation about to be made to your creditors. But it is. I'm
a few weeks away from that. But go ahead.
And it's not that people necessarily can't even pay. It's that if you bought a house for $800,000 and today it's worth $700,000 and you have a $710,000 mortgage, there comes a point where your negative equity in the place is bigger than the moving bill, and at that point you might think, why am I making the bank whole and suffering myself? So if you and while the price of oil is down, the price of fuel is not significantly down, and food prices look like they may continue actually to get worse. It's very hard to think. If you think about elections as referendums, not on candidates, but on the simple question: are you doing better or are you doing worse? I assume that what Barack Obama is going to do at the end of his debate with John McCain, or he debates in the last debate, he will turn to the camera and repeat verbatim Ronald Reagan's question at the end of his debate with Jimmy Carter in 1980.
Are we better off?
Yeah, I mean, I would have him, if I were his debate coach, I'd have him memorize that whole speech and then say, as Ronald, and I want to quote the words of a great American president, Ronald Reagan, to you now. And then you ask the question, is it easier for you to go into the stores and buy things than it was 8 years ago? And you go through that checklist that Reagan went through, and it was pretty powerful. And the answer to all those questions is going to be no. People's incomes did not rise during the Bush years, and now the prices of their most important asset is down by about 15-20% on average. How does an incumbent survive that?
All right, and now that McCain, in one of his several flip-flops, has supported the Bush tax cuts, which are held by some responsible for some of this, and are in any event rhetorically powerful, I think.
I don't think the Bush tax cuts are held responsible for the trouble in the mortgage market.
Well, actually, no, wait a second. I
can't imagine.
I think
construct that for me.
When you have a credit crunch, it's not crazy economics to attribute some of it to a yawning budget deficit. That drives up interest rates.
Yeah, but this credit crunch is not driven by a rise in interest rates. It's driven by a sudden awareness of that the loans weren't as creditworthy as they looked. I mean, if you want to blame the Bush administration for anything, blame them for their relentless pressure on regulatory authorities to relax the standards for loans. One of the things that was true during the Bush years, and I wrote these speeches, was you're looking for good economic news. For the president to brag about. And there isn't that much income, that's relevant to ordinary people. The stock market's going up and up, and total national output is going up and up. But from the point of view of the ordinary person, a number that you can cite, those numbers didn't look so good. Incomes weren't going up, they had those kinds of problems. So there's one number you could always cite that got more and more impressive, and that was the home ownership number. And especially the minority home ownership number, which was important to making inroads into the Latino vote, which was a big priority for the president. And so it was a huge concern of the administration to keep that number rising. And I don't know I forget where it topped out, 67, 68%. But when you drive home ownership from the historic norm of, 60 or a little over, to 68%, obviously you're inviting a lot of people to the market who aren't as creditworthy. And what also then happened, according to Larry Lindsay, was in the relaxed atmosphere, a lot of people were then fraudulently listing as owner-occupied housing that was actually speculatively purchased. And they would then find somebody to claim to be the occupant and the owner, when in fact you had small-time speculators buying 5 and 6 units hoping to score a big gain. The result is we now have like 15 or 18 million unoccupied units in the United States. And it doesn't matter what the interest rate is, you can't sustain that because at some point people buy houses in order to sell them to people who actually want to use them.
Well, I'm happy for you to provide the second reason to blame Bush, but I do think the tax cuts are relevant not just because a budget deficit makes credit harder to come by because the government's in there borrowing and competing for the funds, and I really think an economist would support me on this. I'm not sure. I'm not an economist, but I actually think that part is probably a valid criticism. Of course, the other thing is these were, as they are called, tax cuts for the rich. Why are these lower income people defaulting on their homes? Well, if they had gotten tax cuts, there would have been fewer of them defaulting probably. I just think this is. I'm happy for you to provide this whole second set of ammunition, but I think if Obama's smart, he'll be mentioning these tax cuts a lot and mentioning the fact that McCain now says they were a good idea.
Well, there is. The housing thing does offer at least one cheap Republican point, which is you can make the point. I thought it was rather audacious of Jamie Gorelick to go into the Washington Post yesterday to take the victory lap, which Democrats are entitled to, on the DOJ scandals, because after all, she's one of the biggest beneficiaries of the Fannie Mae boondoggle.
I didn't see her piece, but of course she served in the Clinton DOJ. What did she say?
Well, she went on from serving the Clinton DOJ to be, I think, general counsel. Well, she said, that never in the history of the administration of justice has it ever been thought of to use political considerations in staffing the Justice Department, which is was a little, I think, smug and inaccurate. But it's certainly true that the Bush people pushed this game a little farther than it's ever gone before, and they've been caught, and they're held up to scorn, and that's the way you keep a good Justice Department. So that's fine, and the Democrats are entitled to the victory lap. But Jamie Gorelick has another identity, which is she was general counsel to Fannie Mae, took tens of millions of dollars in payouts from it, in salaries. I mean, there's nothing improper or nothing illegal anyway, but at the time they were overstating their revenues and engaging in a lot of dubious practices in order to sustain their market share, to justify these huge salaries they're paying to herself and Franklin Raines and their predecessor, Jim Johnson. And it's sort of audacious for her then to make herself the voice of integrity and ethics in Washington when she is in a demonstration of some of the things that are wrong here in Washington. That said, people. I don't know how many people. I don't know how many people are going to be interested in that part of the story. They're going to be interested in the fact that mortgages are more expensive.
Herself, would you argue with her on Blogging Heads?
I'd be glad to.
Okay.
I don't know that she would want to do it, but there's a whole host of people who would like to talk to her and others about how do you justify what happened, the enormous salaries that were taken. Is there any hope of reclaiming them? Because these salaries were paid out on the basis of overstated earnings.
Okay. So the other reason I said I'm pessimistic, a little pessimistic about the election is I do think this kind of patriotism card has political legs, which isn't not a tribute to human nature that it does, I think, but it does, and McCain is clearly playing it. I mean, it seems to me one of the more egregious uses of it, as I understand the facts of the case, was McCain in his ads more or less saying that the reason Obama canceled this visit to the troops because they wouldn't let his media in to come and photograph him and videotape him and use it in a whatever. Now there was an article in the Washington Post where they looked into that and found no corroboration for that claim, right?
Right.
So don't you think that's kind of scurrilous on McCain's part?
If the Washington Post is right, then yes. But one of the things, and maybe different people have different views about how campaigns work. I think I am kind of dubious that tactics have a lot of influence on how campaigns work. When I have this, one of the things we can expect after the election is all over is there will be some big story about the genius of whoever was the campaign manager or whoever it was that wins. And my approach to this is always, every 4 years is an election for president, and every 4 years somewhere between 3 and 12 people run, and every 4 years one of them wins. And guess what? That person always has a campaign manager, and afterwards we read all these stories about how brilliant that campaign manager was. But somebody had to win, and that person had to have a campaign manager. And events play a big part. I mean, I really wonder whether there is when you have an election that is about gasoline that is much more expensive than it used to be, food prices that are much more expensive than it used to be, housing prices that are much lower than they used to be, whether any of these tactical gambits matter a great deal. And even if in the end, through the rough and tumble of the campaign process, the McCain people do lead Americans to feel a lot more questions about Barack Obama, questions that are legitimate, by the way. The guy has a very thin record. You do not know what you're getting, and it is really remarkable how many different kinds of people with different points of view are convinced that they're going to get what they want from Barack Obama. They can't all be right. Whereas with McCain, you do have a rough idea of what you get. No matter how many of those questions that people legitimately come to entertain, the fact is they're in a very strong anti-incumbent mood. It's going to be a very difficult election for an incumbent to win, and it will have to be some genius tactical gambit that can make a difference in the face of this.
Yeah. Well, my view is in some ways like yours, in some ways different. I agree that political wizards are given too much credit, just the way stockbrokers are. I mean, look, some series of stock picks is going to look good in retrospect. It doesn't mean the person who made them had any clue what he or she was doing. So I agree at that level, but it's funny, the part that I think may be overemphasized is, there's always this discussion about how do we play this issue, how do we spin this policy, this housing report comes out, this comes in from Iraq, how does our side spin this? And my view is that these kinds of manipulations of policy spin are overrated because ultimately a lot of American voters just look at the candidate and go, do I trust that person or not? Do I like that person or not? And that's why I think that side of the manipulations can matter. And Obama's identity, for reasons you just suggested, is still kind of a fluid thing in the minds of a lot of Americans. Sure. And I think if people can plant doubts about it, people on your side can plant doubts about him, he could well bite the dust. I think this whole patriotism question is still a big question mark in some people's minds. And, I actually want to ask you, I've listened to some of the dialogues you've done with other people in Blogging Heads, and sometimes I have this urge to intervene and reply to you, but of course the technology doesn't permit that.
It's called a telephone. Of course it permits it.
Yeah, we should always make it a conference call, and I'll just be listening in on all of them and intervene when necessary. But one thing. Speaking of patriotism, there are virtues like patriotism, but I'm thinking particularly of honor, which is a big McCain theme, honor and defending Americans' honor. And I think you attribute a significance to honor per se that I don't in a certain sense. In other words, you view it as an intrinsic virtue, right? To some extent, independent of the consequences of defending your honor. It's just a good thing to defend, right?
You mean at the national level or the personal level?
Well, either one. I mean, the personal example, would be dueling, in the age of dueling, when people would say, if you said this about my wife, we'll have to have it out, and then they die, and... I mean, is that good?
I don't endorse dueling.
You don't endorse dueling? Well, damn, that was where I was hoping to trip you up. I introduced it too early.
I forget who it was.
I meant to make it this kind of analogy that leapt out of nowhere and got you at the end of the discussion.
I forget who it was. One of the in Shelby Foote's Civil War, he's got a story of one of the Union generals. My memory suggests it's Ulysses S. Grant, but that somehow doesn't seem right. Who got challenged to a duel by a Southern officer, and the Northern officer accepted, and as the challenged party he had the choice of weapons, and he chose shotguns at one pace. And the Southern was, well, that destroys the point of the thing, we're both going to get slaughtered. And the Northern officer's point was, it's a slaughter, let's not put a fine point on it. If that's the way you want to settle your differences, let's just get the biggest weapons we can and have at each other. So no, I don't endorse dueling.
Did they have the duel?
No, because he
there you go. Mutually assured destruction.
Well, he made the point about the strip away the veneer of honor. What I do think is very important for countries is credit, and that countries are often wise to do things that don't pass the cost-benefit test, because it's important.
Well, what's an example of that? Ideally involving honor.
The classic example of that is the British-French guarantee to Poland in September of 1939. That they had made the guarantee, and there was a lot of reason to think this is actually the worst possible moment for us to fight the Germans, but we've made this pledge. If we violate it, we have no more credit. No one will ever believe anything we say. So even though we either should have defended Czechoslovakia or waited until the Germans attacked somebody whom we could actually help, they had to redeem that national guarantee. In a way, you could say the American pledge to Taiwan is an example of this, because it's very hard to see how the United States would ever honor such a pledge. And at the time it comes, should God forbid it ever come time to honor that pledge, the cost-benefit equation is going to heavily argue against honoring it. And yet, your word in international affairs is important, because countries that honor their word are less. It's like any kind of solvent person. If you look solvent, you're not going to be called on to pay cash all the time.
Okay, but ultimately, your defense of honor actually is a consequentialist defense, as philosophers say. In other words.
Yes.
So far, you're not attributing any intrinsic virtue to defending your honor. You're saying defending it in the long term pays more dividends than not defending it. So it's a utility. There are two kinds of utilitarianism.
Right.
There's act-based, and then there's rule-based. And you're just the rule-based is what would be the consequences over time if everyone did this as a rule. If the consequences would be good, then it's good to do it as a rule.
I'm busted on the utilitarianism count. I mean, I remember during the heyday of sort of the neocon conspiracy theories being told that we were all Straussian, so I went out and bought some books by Leo Strauss because I thought I'd better know what he was saying, since he was supposed to have had such a big influence on my thinking. But I have to plead guilty. I am a utilitarian, but I do believe.
That's fine then. I'm with you then. I mean, but I could probably point to some times when you've invoked honor, what I would argue there is not even a long-term consequentialist defense of your position. But I'm glad to know we're on the same plane philosophically.
But I think it's really important that the United States have a reputation of that when called upon, it will meet its obligations, and that's why sometimes smaller and weaker countries like Israel often have to do things that look kind of crazy, because you need to just look like. And there's a passage in, I think, Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities, where these two cops in a car driving through a tough area, and one's a huge guy and one's a little guy, but the little guy has just got this expression of ferocity on his face, and something is going on untoward. The little guy walks over and intervenes, and everyone defers to him, and the big guy thinks, "Gee, if I were in the middle of that, I would have won any kind of fight that there was, but I would have had to fight because they wouldn't believe that I was going to." Whereas this little guy, who probably would lose the fight, everybody is so certain that he's just busting for a chance to fight, they back away from him.
So it's you must be crazy to have done this, and therefore we won't mess with you.
We know you will fight and therefore it's not the madman theory exactly, but we know that when you say don't cross this line. It's very important that you be believed when you say don't cross this line. And it's amazing how then little fighting you actually have to do.
Yeah, well, actually, Israel is a good segue to one other thing I wanted to ask you about. I mean, I'm not sure I would agree that Israel is like the little guy in the Middle East. It's the most powerful, most militarily powerful nation in the vicinity, but...
Plus divine protection. Those two things do end up to a winning conflict.
Those two things.
But they still have the very small population, very small land mass, and probably the least margin of survival of anybody. So they've got a fair claim to the little guy title.
Yeah. Well, in any event, this other time I wanted to jump into a dialogue of yours that technology didn't permit me to jump into, there was just a little kind of analytical point I wanted to engage you on. I think you were talking to Daniel Levy, the former Israeli negotiator, and you were saying the Palestinians, well, tell me how I've got it wrong. I'll put it the wrong way, and you can straighten me out. Palestinians don't deserve a better deal than they're being offered in terms of land, two-state solution, whatever, or shouldn't get one because in the past, and maybe you were referring to the Second Intifada or something, or various things, they've lost these past battles or these past wars or something, right? How was it? What was your argument?
If I used the language of desert, then I didn't express this idea very well. My point
you may not have.
My point is this: that the world has offered first the Arab states and then the Palestinians since 1948 really a one-way option on the war with Israel, which is go to war, and if you win, you win. And if you lose, well, you suffer no enduring consequences. You're entitled to go back to where you were before you started the war and lost. And unsurprisingly, this has been a recipe for continuing the conflict, because one of the ways peace comes is when people acknowledge that they're defeated. They may not like the outcome of the dispute, but they just say, we have more to gain than we have to lose from. We have more to lose than to gain from prolonging this. But when Yasser Arafat did something actually fairly rational. When he decided in 2000, he got the best offer any Arab leader had ever gotten from the Israelis, or any Palestinian leader had gotten. Maybe he didn't like it, it wasn't the best he could imagine, but it was the best he'd ever had. And he then said, let me go to war, and let me see if I can do even better. And he went to war in the knowledge that if he lost, which ultimately happened, that he wouldn't have lost anything strategic because at the next round of talks, we just resumed from the last Israeli offer. And this is a formula for perpetuating the conflict. So I think it is very important that potential aggressors, not just Palestinians, but anybody know, look, if you take the gamble of resorting to war and you lose, you're going to be worse off. So think very hard. And the offers that were on the table in 2000, I think it's really important that they not be back on the table because, and not just because of a matter of moral desert, but because it screws up the incentives. And that one of the things that has perpetuated this conflict is the constant assurance of the world community to the Palestinians that time is on their side, which it isn't. And so they keep saying, their leaders keep saying, well, let's go back to the gaming tables again and again and again and count on the rest of the world to fill up our chip box once our chips are exhausted.
I guess I'd say a few things. First of all, I think the reporting is that the Yasser Arafat genuinely didn't think he could sell the 2000 agreement, although it wasn't classic, democracy by any means. It wasn't taking it to the polls. I think he reportedly didn't think he could survive politically, but or physically. I mean, he thought he would be killed, but anyway, he thought there would be a lot of resistance to that. I think if you look at the details of what he was offered, it's not totally surprising because it turns out it really doesn't. They weren't going to be giving a state in the sense in which we mean the word state. We mean like control over your airspace, for example. They weren't going to have that. There were a lot of things they weren't going to have. The territory swaps weren't quite, didn't quite add up to 100% and so on. But anyway, leave that aside. The point I was going to make was you're saying two things. They decided to start the war, and you're referring to the Second Intifada, and then they lost. Right. Those are the two. Those are two key parts of your analysis.
Right.
Okay. I guess I would say there's two parts of that, and the only part I really want to engage you on is whether they lost. Separately, there is the issue of from their point of view, and I think it's always useful to look at things from the point of view of the person you might be negotiating with, or in any event want to outmaneuver. From their point of view, they would of course not say that. I don't think they'd quite say they started the war. In other words, I think you would agree it's not always the case that the person who fires the first shot is actually the person you would say started the war. I mean, in 1967, Israel fired the first shot, but you don't go around saying Israel started that war, right?
No, because it was the Egyptians had previously violated the terms of the armistice that ended in 1956. Well,
exactly, and what the Palestinians would say is that the Israeli settlements are in violation of international law, and they're not alone. I'm not an expert on this, but there's certainly a lot of Western analysts who say that the settlements are in violation of international law. And in fact, Gershom Gorenberg's book, The Accidental Empire, I think established that before they set up the first settlement, the Israeli government's own advisor said this is in violation
even if true, that's completely
the Geneva Convention, right?
Even if true, that's completely irrelevant.
I'm just saying this is their perspective.
But the question is, okay, in September of 2000, there is no state of war between the Israeli government and the rulers of the Palestinian Authority, and in October of 2000 there is. So it's not like
so too with 1967. But if the person who fires the first shot is convinced that the other person is in violation of international law, that's the way they're going to think about it. That's the only point I'm making.
But seeing it from the Palestinian point of view,
it's not universally agreed
they didn't resort
in
to
either case.
They didn't resort to violence.
The war.
They didn't resort to violence on the day and week they did because of Israeli settlement activity. They resorted to violence on the day and week they did, exactly as you say, because Yasser Arafat took a look at this deal and decided, for whatever reason, he didn't like it. now, even if
well, there was the other provocation, the famous Ariel Sharon visit that everyone agrees was predictably going to seriously antagonize the Palestinians and was done for political reasons.
Right,
but,
for sure. But then they had a choice about how to respond to that, and they could have had a peaceful protest. They could have sent letters to the New York Times. There are all kinds of things they could have done in response to that provocation. They chose this one, and and the fact that I think that it was in the middle of this negotiation process, I think is very relevant. I think a lot of the people who have sort of looked at the captured documents buy that theory. But as you said, whatever justification they may have had in their own minds, this is the step they took in that time and place, and it led to this an escalating series of violent acts coming to a head in 2002, ending with the construction of the security fence. And ending with the Palestinian sovereignty over the West Bank, which had existed, not near sovereignty, rule over the West Bank, which had existed, destroyed. So that looks to me like a military defeat. And now we're going to start this process all over again.
That's the other point I was going to engage you on, was just that, from their point of view, this is a war of resistance against foreign occupation. You would agree that that's their perspective,
yeah, for
right?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so as for how they define victory and loss, I don't think with either the first or second intifada they were under the illusion that they would do this for a few months or a year and a half, and then Israel would say, here's everything you want. I think the perspective of someone who's mounting what they consider a resistance against foreign occupation is what you do is steadily raise the costs of occupation, and you try to make the costs to you of raising those costs acceptable. In other words, it's a question of the relative costs on both sides. And in other words, what they would say, I think, is we're going to deploy this violence and show them that in the long run, occupation is going to lead to trouble. Now,
and then they get kicked, and then they get kicked in the head, and they got beaten. And at that point, the international community,
David, I'm contesting the definition of beaten here. I'm not going to just accept the assertion. I want you to engage my analysis of what constitutes defeat.
Well, let me put it this way: when your would-be state, which you did rule in month one, is now invaded and reoccupied, when your instrumentalities of power are destroyed, and when you have lost the ability to strike at the enemy, because of the rise of the fence, the Palestinians have largely lost that ability to strike at Israel. That looks to me like a pretty bad defeat. And now the question is, what response does the international community have? And what the international community wants is not a Palestinian state. And by the way, I don't think the international community particularly wants an Israeli state. The international community wants this quarrel settled. And one way it could be settled, theoretically, is by the destruction of Israel and a Palestinian victory. And I think there are a lot of people who would say better that it be that this conflict be settled.
Not all Palestinians are defining victory as the destruction of Israel.
But theoretically,
go ahead.
That could happen. That's one way to do it. But the best way is that there be a permanent settlement. And then you have to look at the incentives various sides have, and those incentives vary according to the power that each brings to the table. I mean, the world offered in 1953, Britain and the United States tried to persuade Israel to sign a peace treaty at the expense of giving up a big bunch of the 1948 territories. There was going to be a corridor, I think, across the Negev Desert. Israel was to surrender its 1948 boundaries because that was their assessment of the relative power situation. And if you continually offer hope that you can get a settlement from the world community that is greater than the one you can win yourself, you create a lot of incentives to prolong the conflict. And what the Palestinians need now are incentives to end the conflict. And I think a tougher line from the global community would give them better incentives. And since our interest in all of this is seeing this conflict over, we have to be very wary of giving them incentives that are conflict prolonging.
Well, of course, from their point of view, what the Israelis need is the incentive to end the settlements. But I guess what I would say is, you're right that the security fence has, for the time being, made Israel safer than it would have been if it hadn't built the fence. And it may be that the immediate provocation for building the fence was the Second Intifada, and in that sense there hasn't been a short-term... if the goal of the Intifada was to raise the perceived costs of continued occupation, then it has not immediately succeeded. On the other hand, I'd say building the fence is something Israel could have done at any time. It was a card they always had that they could play. And B, I don't think long-term this is going to give them protection. Fences and walls were very effective in the Middle Ages when the most sophisticated armaments were always carried by horses. But the fact is, more and more of the kinds of armaments that can get over fences are going to fall into the hands of smaller and smaller groups of intensely motivated people. It's the trend of technological development, remotely controlled airplanes and homemade missiles and so on.
Biological warfare is actually the thing
all kinds of stuff. And I don't think that wall is going to buy long-term security for Israel. So
I didn't make that claim. All I'm saying is and this is the thing I was saying to Daniel Levy, that when you say to anybody, go to war, if you win, you win, and if you lose, you'll be put back where you were before the war, people are going to be much more incentivized to choose war. If you say, however, go to war, and if you win, you win, and if you lose, the consequences are going to be unpleasant, people get different incentives. And I think that's...
So what do you think they're going to do? What are you hoping the Palestinians will do?
What do I hope?
If you play hardball, if Israel plays hardball the way you want them to and doesn't put anything even as good as Camp David on the table, I guess ever, I don't know, what is it you want? What is it you think the Palestinians will do that will be good for Israel's security?
Have leadership that truly and fully accepts the principle that there is going to be Palestinian statehood only in the West Bank and Gaza. That there will be no claims on Israel, none of this nonsense about a right of return. That if you are the homeland of the Palestinian people, then you're the home to the Palestinian people. That's where the boundary is, and you have no other claims. And that the boundary line is going to be negotiated according to facts on the ground. That is what I would like to see. That is what I think that's what they're going to get when the conflict ends. That's how it's going to end.
If it ends. I mean, the last thing, on right of return, I think everybody agrees that in the end, you don't give them complete right of return. There's some kind of buyout or finessing of that. But even if nominally it's called right of return, but you have the option of becoming a millionaire by foregoing your right, But anyway, the last thing I say is this is a non-zero sum game, right? So first of all, it's...
You believe that, and I believe that, and I think the Israelis believe that. I don't know how many people in the Palestinian territories believe that.
Well, I think there are Palestinians who are saying the exact same thing about the Israelis, probably. It's a question of which side of the fence you sit on. But the one thing I would say is, what you're saying is we're not going to put, under any circumstances right now, a palatable deal on the table for the Palestinians because we have to punish them for the way they reacted to the last deal we thought was palatable. And you're saying we have to do that because we have to teach them this long-term lesson. And one thing I would say is, look, if you've got a deal that actually could lead to stable peace, you don't need long-term lessons, okay? Right. That would end the problem.
Yes, and I don't like the language of punishment because we're not dealing with recalcitrant children. If the we here means the United States, the United States has other reasons to be careful about getting drawn into accepting responsibility for settling this conflict. There's a reason why presidents tend to get interested in the 8th year of their term because they have a lot of things they need to do first. And if it is a Barack Obama presidency or if it's a John McCain presidency, they're going to have a lot of immediate things they're going to need to do, and this can become a tremendous time sink, and in a funny way,
and a worthwhile one in my view. But
maybe, but it can't matter more to the United States than it matters to the parties.
I don't know about that. I think a primary threat to America's long-term national security is the continued irresolution of this particular issue. I really do.
All right. When I say it can't. Maybe that was the wrong verb. What I mean is, it can't be. The United States can't resolve it if it matters more to the United States than it does to either of the parties.
Well, I guess I would be pessimistic if I thought that America's and Israel's interests weren't ultimately aligned here, and for that matter, the Palestinians. I mean, if I thought there was a great divergence, then I would think that yes, this issue matters so much to Israel that American leverage, is going to be limited. You're not going to be able to force them to do something that's not in their interest. But I think actually, what's in our interest is in Israel's interest, which is a solution to the problem. It's also in the Palestinians' interest. So I don't have that particular concern. I fear that maybe Israelis are so manifestly threatened on a day-to-day basis that it may be harder for them to see my perspective than it would be if they had the luxury of sitting here and viewing it with greater detachment. I worry about that. But I don't think the actual interests are so divergent that that's a problem.
I don't know. I'm conscious of having gone over time that probably there are about 3 people left watching this thing. But I would say the thing that is sort of maddening and frustrating about this conflict is, in some ways, it's the easiest of all the world's conflicts to solve. I mean, I often compare it. I have tax obligations in both the United States and Canada, and I often compare this to the U.S.-Canada tax treaty. So figuring out how to deal with undistributed royalties in the lumber industry, that's a really difficult problem. This is not that difficult if the will to solve it is there. The day a Palestinian leader says, I categorically accept that Israel is here to stay, I welcome it, I want this conflict over, and we look forward to the creation of a Palestinian state only in the West Bank and Gaza. That's the only place it's ever going to be, and I repudiate anything beyond that. The kind of statement, by the way, that led to the settlement of the Anglo-Irish conflict in 1920. It would be over. It would be over. The rest would just be haggling over the details. It's the lack of that that is the thing that prolongs this.
Well, I'm tempted to say something in reply, but I think we could talk forever, and that would always be the case at the end of one of your utterances. So I'll let you have the last word.
All right, let's hope the blood pressures are now throbbing across blogging headland.
Mine's actually okay, surprisingly, but I do hope that we've caused several near-death experiences out there in living rooms all across America.
And it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
But thank you, David. This has really been a great conversation.
Thank you, Bo. Pleasure to talk to you. Bye-bye.